Welcome back to Practical Christian Lessons, and today I'm talking with Peter Williams about early Christology and the pretty clear evidence of it in the early church. Let's get into it. So I just want to lead off this video noting, you'll notice that the audio quality and things are going to be a little different between the two sections where Peter's talking and I'm here. That's because we just could not get my microphone to work during this. I tried different microphones, we tried changing audio settings, filtering background sounds. For whatever reason, it just came out really wonky. There will be a few spots in the video where you'll hear a little bit of it in our when he's talking, and I'll say yes or something, and you might hear it pop up in the background. But we decided we're just going to puzzle on through it, and I will re-record those parts. So you'll see me interjecting here just to note some of the things that I said in the original video, and I'm coming back to record after. If you don't know who Peter Williams is, he is a scholar out of England, and he has done a lot of great and interesting work. He's worked on music, he's worked on pop culture and theology and how we can have some interesting overlaps there. He's got some interesting stuff on the theology of monsters I'd love to dig into more sometime. And today, in particular, we're talking about archaeology and how it points to a high Christology all the way back, likely to the apostles themselves. In fact, I would say it does point to the apostles themselves. And we talk a little bit about James, but maybe in another video we'll get to delve into that a little bit more than we did here. You guys enjoy.
And thank you very much for having me on your channel. And really, I guess the thing you reached out to me over, which we'll talk about in a bit, was about the Epistle of James and an article that I'd published on high Christology in James. But that got us onto the subject of high Christology in general, and I mentioned that I have some material looking at archaeology and what that shows about people's beliefs about Jesus. So I said I had a few slides that I could go through just to give a little presentation about high Christology in archaeology, and then we can talk more about James after that. So let's see if I manage to get the technology to work. This slide, just to start with a popular source of misinformation, as it were. Dan Brown's famous best-selling novel, The Da Vinci Code, where you have just this little snatch of conversation between characters, one of whom is saying that Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nevertheless. Not the Son of God, says another character. Right, says this Professor Teeming. He says Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea. Right? The Council of Nicaea was a church council in the 4th century that took place in 325 AD. Now, this is an idea that many Muslims, for example, have this idea that attributing divinity to Jesus was an innovation decided upon at the Council of Nicaea. For example, a conspiracy theory along those lines is seen in the book Jesus, a Prophet of Islam, by Muslim apologist Muhammad Atta-ur-Rahman. But as agnostic New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman writes, the Council of Nicaea was not a council that met to decide whether or not Jesus was divine. The question being debated was how to understand Jesus' divinity in light of the circumstance that he was also human. And there was certainly no vote to determine Jesus' divinity. This was already a matter of common knowledge among Christians and had been from the early years of the religion. And that is something that you can show overwhelmingly, I think, from literary sources. But it's an interesting question to look at what you can get from archaeological sources on that topic. So I'll gradually work backwards in time, back towards Jesus' day, as it were, starting in 270-ish AD with what's called the Good Shepherd ring. Fairly recent find, a gold ring with a gemstone with a carved image of a young Jesus holding a lamb on his back, a scene known as the Good Shepherd in Christianity. One of several artifacts found in shipwrecks off the coast of Israel. And I got a quote from the Israeli Antiquities Authority, had announced that it recovered this treasure from 2 shipwrecks found in the ancient port of Caesarea. And this ring, which is from about 270 AD, was found amongst a trove of 3rd century Roman coins. And of course, this kind of image of Jesus as the shepherd links with Jesus' own language, particularly in places like John 10:11, with the Gospel of Mark's description of Jesus as a shepherd, and that resonates back to the Old Testament language from the Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Very recent find from 2024, something called the Frankfurt inscription. It's 1,000, a little 3.5 centimeter long silver amulet with a wafer thin sheet of rolled up silver foil, discovered beneath the chin of a skeleton in a Frankfurt cemetery in 2018. This is the oldest evidence of Christianity north of the Alps, according to this 2024 study. Archaeologists discovered this in a grave of a man who died around 230 to 270 AD. This little amulet. And it was only in 2024, though, although it was discovered in 2018, that researchers were able to scan and then kind of virtually unroll the silver foil to read the Latin inscription on the foil. I won't read the whole inscription for you. The bits in brackets with question marks, there are areas of uncertainty, but you can see in the areas that they're clear about, let me particularly highlight these bits in orange where it's talking about Jesus Christ, Son of God, the Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, and that before Jesus Christ every knee bows, every tongue confesses. Now that is resonant with the language of New Testament literature from Philippians 2, at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, which itself is reflecting language from the Old Testament, where in Isaiah 45, God speaking about himself, by myself I have sworn, to me, to God, every knee shall bow, every tongue shall swear allegiance. This is the sketch of the floor plan of a 3rd century church at Dura Europos in what's now modern day Syria. And you'll see this baptistry listed up here. And there are a number of wall paintings in this baptistry room. And right above the baptismal pool is again this image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. And then there are a number of paintings, fascinating paintings on the wall. This one I think is particularly interesting for our purposes, with the togaed figure with an arm stretched out over someone lying on a bed, and also a picture of someone carrying their bed. This is a rather literal cultural interpretation of an incident from the Gospels. I think this is clearly a picture of Jesus healing the paralytic, who says, your sins are forgiven, and there's this whole controversy, and Jesus tells the man to, pick up his bed and walk. In the 1st century cultural context, that's like bedroll, but here they've got a rather sturdy bed being carried by this guy who's just been healed by Jesus. But of course, the whole point of this incident that it's reflecting is the controversy over Jesus saying that this guy's sins are forgiven, and the Jews saying, Jesus is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Then we have the mosaic discovered in the grounds of the prison in Megiddo when they were doing some renovations. A mosaic of a Christian prayer hall that comes from about 230 AD. One interesting thing is this mosaic with fish in it. Here's a close-up of the fish. And we know, of course, that the fish was an early Christian symbol. The Greek word ichthus formed an acrostic where you take, each letter of the word is the first letter of a new word, a different word. And it's an acrostic for what translates into English as Jesus Christ, God's Son, Saviour. Which is why you still get the fish symbol. People put them on their, car bumpers even to this day. But even more kind of clinching on this mosaic is a Greek mosaic inscription, one of several inscriptions. This one is talking about the person who'd kind of given the money to. This is the plinth of the table in the middle of the room, probably where they had communion at the table. And this mosaic mentions that the God-loving Akeptus has offered the table to God Jesus Christ as a memorial. Greeks did overlining instead of underlining, but the God Jesus Christ bit is overlined. There's a close-up of that mosaic. This is the Alexamenos graffito from Rome, discovered scratched into the plasterwork of a wall on the Palatine Hill in Rome, in some, I think it was some slave quarters, dated to around 200 AD. This figure with a donkey head on a cross, and another figure with again upraised hand, kind of looking up at the donkey-headed figure on the cross. And the legend scrawled beneath this picture, Alexamenos worships his god, or Alexamenos, worship your god. Now, why donkey head? It's already clear from context, like who might somebody be worshipping who had been crucified? But this donkey head is a particularly interesting facet of this. The 2nd century Christian scholar Tertullian confirms that Christians were accused of worshipping a divinity with the head of an ass. Tertullian traces the roots of this back to the Roman historian Tacitus, who believed that the Israelites were led out of Egypt by an ass. Also, the historian Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, notes that to Greek scholars the question of what might be found in the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple was a tantalizing one. Of course, only the high priest was allowed in the Holy of Holies. The Greek writer Posidonius, I'm not quite pronouncing that correctly, Posidonius, never knowingly without a theory, claimed that this Holy of Holies contained a golden ass's head. Others believed it held the stone image of a man with a long beard sitting on a donkey. So this association between ass-donkey imagery and the Jewish God indicates that the Alexamenos graffito is representing Alexamenos worshipping a crucified man whom he is identifying as the Jewish God. And then finally we have the Pompeii Rotas or Sator Square. Now, of course, Pompeii was buried under the volcanic explosion of Pompeii, so we can securely date this to prior to 79 AD. It's found in various Roman places, including Cirencester here in England, and Pompeii. So this dates from, at the latest, 46 years post-crucifixion, if we peg that at 33 AD. It's a Latin palindrome written horizontally and vertically. It has a backwards spelling that translates to "Farmer Arepo works his plough," but you can arrange the letters into a cross shape with the single N at the centre, as it is the N in the centre of the square there. And in Aramaic, the name of this letter, Nun, carries the meaning of a fish, which, as we've already seen, was an early Christian symbol. With N in the middle of the cross, and then Our Father, in Latin, the opening of the Lord's Prayer, and the letters Alpha and Omega at the end, both horizontally and vertically, as we have in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide here. So Paternoster, Our Father, Alpha and Omega. It's in Revelation 1:8 that Jesus says, "I am the Alpha and Omega, who is and was to come, the Almighty," for example. Although Revelation comes from the end of the first century. The letters can also be arranged into a prayer. "I pray to you, Father, I pray to you, Father, you heal." And the symbolism is definitely Christian and or Jewish. So there's, some scholarly debate and discussion over whether this must be interpreted in a Christian way or not. But of course, Jesus is depicted as a farmer sowing seeds in gospel passages such as Matthew 13, 3-9 and 37 to 38. The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. Terence Mitchell, who's the former keeper of Western Asiatic antiquities at the British Museum here in the UK, argues that on the principle that the simplest explanation is the best, unraveling this Sotar puzzle as a Christian text gains first place. If this is correct, there were people in Pompeii who knew at least the first words of the Lord's Prayer in Latin before 79. And the imagery of Jesus as the Father, the Alpha and Omega, which the New Testament then applies to Jesus, all go to indicate a high Christology. So to put that all on a kind of timeline for us, we've got Jesus being crucified over here at 33, and some 100-year markers and the Council of Nicaea over here at 325. Well, then the Good Shepherd and the Frankfurt ring and inscription take us to about 50 years before the Council of Nicaea, so half a century before Nicaea, indicating a high Christology. We push that back with the Megiddo Church and the Dura-Europos Church to around 95 years before Nicaea, so about a century before Nicaea. The Alexamenos Graffito takes us to 125 years-ish before Nicaea. This NCE 156 inscription, I don't know why the slide didn't show. It's a funereal inscription. That certainly includes Christian elements, although it may also contain some Gnostic elements. But the Christian elements talk about glorifying the Father and the Son. So seems to evince some sort of high Christology. About a range of datings here, 175 to 125 years before Nicaea. And if we go with the Christian interpretation of the Pompeii Rotas square, 279 years before Nicaea, a mere 46 years at most after the crucifixion. So I give a kind of range of certainties on that. I notice there is more scholarly debate about the interpretation of the Pompey square. That would be, really very interesting if it was certainly Christian or most likely Christian. But we can certainly push a high Christology well before the Council of Nicaea, looking at things like the Alexamenos Graffito, the Megiddo Church, and so on. There we go. Yeah, stop the screen sharing and we'll have a chat.
So after Peter's presentation, I have two questions. And the first one is, how do we know the shepherd ring is of Christ? I think most of the presentations pretty clearly. These are artifacts pointing towards Christ. And I think the ring itself seems pretty standard as a thing that points towards Christ himself. Seems pretty strong. And Dr. Peter sent me some additional stuff I'll put down in the comments below on the ring as well. He sent after the fact, after he went and checked up on a few more things afterwards, just to see how scholarship has changed since the last time we looked, and happy to share that. Also below, while you're there, you'll see his website, you'll see a link to his book that he talks about in this video. Go and check those things out as well.
Yeah, and my honest answer here is, because I'm an amateur in the archaeology, I'm reliant upon the scholars that I'm reading. It seems to be the opinion in various sources that I've looked at, that this is the case, even though it's true to point out that this shepherd imagery is also used in Greco-Roman pagan contexts. But I think the opinion is that Greco-Roman imagery got taken over by the Christian imagery, as it were, and that must be something to do with the contexts that they find this imagery appearing in. Certainly, when you're looking at the Dura Europos house church context, and you have that imagery of the shepherd over the baptismal pool in a room full of other pictures of scenes of Jesus from the Gospels, you know that imagery has to be talking about Jesus. It's the argument seems a little less straightforward to me as a non-expert when you just have that ring, for example. But all the sources that I could find that were reporting on the find describe it that way. But if you want to think, well, that doesn't seem particularly secure, at least without going into that more, well, fine, just chuck it out. It's not going to make much of a difference to the overall kind of case. I think some of the examples from the archaeology gave us are so clear that they flatly blow the Council of Nicaea divinity of Jesus theory out of the water. And certainly, if you're looking at this as a cumulative case, where maybe history is often a matter of interpretation rather than knockdown proof, right?
Yep.
But I think we've got quite a number of finds over a spread of geography and history, which taken together indicate that people before the Council of Nicaea, there were people at least who had some sort of high view of Jesus being divine in some sense, and in some cases very clearly, as I was saying with the Alexamenos, for example, which is before that ring that we were talking about, in around 200. Jesus as the Jewish God. So nothing much hangs on that one example, if you like. Yeah, if you want to be bending over backwards to be super cautious, so that's fine.
The next question's both sort of a question and a statement. There are people who will often charge the Gospels, especially, as being copies of copies of copies. And these documents didn't exist until 50 years after Christ. Anyway, 80. That's the earliest dating for like Mark. And of course, there's some scholarship that will debate that. But just to take a generally safe line for those who are pushing towards the skeptical side, 80 tends to be the earliest some of these groups will allow it. So they'll say, it's decades after, copies of copies of copies. How do we know that we actually have reliable information that's been passed down and is then written down? How do we know that those Gospels we have are reliable?
That opens up a whole kind of can about textual criticism, really. And there's a number of avenues that one could come at this at. Even studies that pop to mind on the length at which written texts stayed in circulation before they got old enough that copies needed to be made of them. And actually they stayed in use, and people would, if it was getting faded, kind of just write over the letters that were already there to refresh them anyway, which guarantees pretty high accuracy, right, before you're making a hand copy of the manuscript. And they stayed in circulation for such a long time that some of our earliest New Testament manuscript fragments could well be like first copies, only one generation, or even it's possible first, but geography I think would count against that. We know, studies of the kind of general accuracy of particularly Jewish religious scribal culture. You can compare, thinking of Old Testament studies when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we had a much older copy of Isaiah, for example, than we'd had before, like hundreds of years earlier than the oldest copy that we had previously. And you can then compare those manuscripts and see very little difference between the contents of those. I would also push back on the datings that were mentioned, that were the premise of those questions. So there are arguments for dating the New Testament Gospels earlier than that, at least when you're talking about the synoptics. I would put Gospel of John at the end of the first century. I think that's kind of the scholarly central ground on that. Whatever kind of end of the theological spectrum you're coming from, you'll find lots of agreement on John is the end of the first century. But you'll find much more disagreement about dating the synoptics. And personally, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that Mark could have been 49, 50, around there, and that Matthew and Luke, although after Mark, are pre Jewish war, pre fall of Jerusalem. And of course, scholars aren't so particularly interested in the dates of those Gospels as finalized compositions, but more about the sources that those Gospels are drawing upon. So the whole discussion about Q, whether that's a written source or an oral compendium, one or more people that material is drawing upon. The fact that Luke explicitly refers to other people who have written accounts that he's drawing on, and that he's interviewed eyewitnesses. The importance of oral testimony storytelling within, again, particularly Jewish Christian traditions. If you look at work by folks like Richard Bauckham in his book on Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, I think very interesting material there. And when you're talking about Christology, well, fine, let's set aside the Gospels. Let's go to the New Testament letters. Let's go to even the letters of Paul that are universally across the theological spectrum agreed to be genuine Pauline letters from the middle of the first century, from the 50s, right? And you can see a high Christology. Let's talk about, for example, the Epistle of James and the high Christology that you can find in the Epistle of James. And I would argue there's good evidence that James is pre-Jewish war, so kind of pre-66. And there is some evidence to date it as early as kind of, I don't know, 47, 48, around about there. And again, we're dealing with history, and these arguments are all going to be a matter of a kind of cumulative case arguments of best explanation of the available data. But you still have to deal with the evidence that we have and go where you think the evidence on balance points, right? So if we have a high Christology in James, which is very likely, no later than just before the Jewish war, and could well be around about 50 AD. If Jesus was crucified in 33, this is not long after. And as I point out in the essay that you contact me about, and there's an updated form of that essay in my book on Behold the Man, essays on the historical Jesus. Kind of did a revised version of that in there. James is clearly writing this general epistle to a Jewish Christian diaspora audience who agree with him about this. This is not a matter of controversy within the letter. And James is the author. I take it that James is the author, but let's call him James, whether or not that really is James, the brother of Jesus. He's certainly a Jewish Christian author who believes in a high Christology, which he presumably formulated before he wrote the letter, that he is writing to people for whom this is not a matter of controversy. And so this idea of a high Christology applied to the figure of Jesus must have existed and then spread with these people to where they are in the diaspora, from Jerusalem, from Israel, where Jesus lived and taught and had his first disciples, right? So that pushes the conceptual belief in the divinity of Jesus prior to whenever you date the letter by, I don't know, some, right?
Yeah.
So, and if the letter's like 48, 49, and Jesus died in 33, and the beliefs come from before the letter, that is not a big gap, particularly in terms of anything that in ancient history, when we're looking at, of course we want sources as close to the event as possible, but there's, plenty of things that we believe in classics or ancient history on the basis of testimony from a lot longer after events. And we don't just chuck out the whole of ancient history by saying, oh, good grief, that was like a couple of decades after the event. Maybe they got everything completely wrong and we can't trust any of it.
Yeah. And of course, I agree with Peter. I think, we don't check out Plato and Aristotle or Homer because it comes hundreds of years after, at least for our earliest manuscripts of these things. And we trust that those things are generally pretty reliable. Why are we questioning the Gospels, who have much shorter time span between the event and the manuscript, and all sorts of other things? If you can delve into textual criticism with scholars like Daniel Wallace, you'll find plenty of. But the next part that we're going to talk about here, at least briefly, is James, the Epistle of James and Christology, and his high Christology. I've been working on a paper for this. That's why I reached out to Peter, and that's why I brought him on the channel to talk about early high Christology. High Christology just being a reference to having a high view of the figure of Jesus. In this case, a high view of his divinity and what it meant that he was our Lord and Messiah. And Peter's going to be introducing that himself. Since we were having technical difficulties, I figured best to just let him explain it.
So some years ago, I published a journal article in my college's journal, in open access journal called Theophilus. I'm with NLR University College in Norway. I was an assistant professor, but now I'm an adjunct professor with them. And then a couple of years ago, I did a revised version of that, updated version of that paper in my book, Behold the Man, Essays on the Historical Jesus. And really what caught my interest in this was coming across the fact that not only does James refer to Jesus as Lord, which many people will argue evinces a high Christology, but his discussion in that letter, where he's talking to his audience about how rich people are blaspheming the noble name of him that is called over you. And while that seems to be a reference to blasphemy catches the ear, and you look into the word there, and it doesn't have to mean blasphemy in the sense of blasphemy against God. It can just mean talking ill of someone. But it caught my attention. And what name are they blaspheming? The name that is called over the audience that James is writing to. Now, this language of a name being called over as well is Old Testament language that is used there for the name of God being called over Israel as the people of God, that God's name being called over them, signifying God's kind of ownership of Israel, as it were. And then this language is being used by James, talking about those blaspheming the noble name of him that's called over you, his audience. Well, I think contextually that could either be literally people using the name Christian, which originated as outsider language. We see from Luke's writings that the people that we would now call Christians originally described themselves as followers of the way of Jesus, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, followers of the way. But it was outsiders, as Luke records, who first used this name Christian as a term of abuse. It's a kind of portmanteau word that means Christ slaves. Basically, you're saying, you stupid people who've made yourselves slaves to this crucified, failed Christ figure, you idiots. So that could be one way in which people are blaspheming the name of Christ in using the word Christian of these folks that James is writing to. Or I also came across the theory it could be talking about the name of Christ literally being called over people in baptism. An interpretation that you see coming out even in some translations of this verse, where they're going for a more idiomatic translation rather than a word for word kind of literal translation. But we don't really need to resolve that dispute about what is meant there, because either way we have a reference here to Christ directly or indirectly. And if Christ is the noble, or the beautiful, the kalos name that is called over these folks that James is writing to, and outsiders are blaspheming this noble name that's called over them, given the Old Testament usage of that phraseology that James is using, that again would seem to indicate that the best explanation of that is that this is an indication of a high Christology. So we have a number of data points in the Epistle of James that evince a high Christology. Now, the question of, was this written by James, the brother of Jesus? is an interesting but separable question. Um, I think there's a good cumulative case that it was written by James, the brother of Jesus, and that would be one pointer towards a dating for the letter, because, of course, we know on independent grounds from Josephus, for example, that James was martyred as a Christian. I think it was in 62. So that would put the letter from before 62. But there are also an independent cumulative case from the kind of circumstance that the letter is writing to, things that it mentions, things that it doesn't mention, and yes, arguments from silence have to be treated with care. But there's a combination kind of cumulative case that's also independent of dating it via thinking that the author is James, that would also date this letter to good evidence, I think, that it's pre-Jewish war, and some reason to date it as early as prior to 50, probably prior to the Jerusalem Council recorded in Acts 15, which would put the letter at around about 47 AD. And again, given that Jesus was crucified in 33, this is a very small gap on either of those datings. And as I say, there's a stronger case for saying, well, pre-Jewish war. If you think it was James, then pre-62, and some indications, kind of balance of evidence case, I think, for it being as early as kind of 47-ish. So those are interesting, that you have this very Jewish Christian letter that uses kind of Jewish idiomatic ways of speaking that indicate a high Christology. And of course, particularly interesting if that was written by the actual James, the half brother of Jesus. So I'll pass back to you, Joshua, to see if you have any questions to punt in my direction.
With that, I thought it was prudent to point out that, and Peter and I had talked about this as well, he and I aren't saying anything new here. If you look through his article and follow his citations, when my article comes out, Lord willing, this fall with the Asbury Theological Journal, then follow the citations there, and you'll find everything we're saying has been said before, even if it's not said as loudly or as often as other parts of scholarship might talk about certain things. And that kind of stems from a number of issues. And I'll have my own little blurb on that. Many of these articles, essays, books that talk about this same topic introduce that same discussion that's been had. And whether or not we parse it out a little differently, we both agree on the point that James has been one of those writings in the Bible that's been neglected by and large. And even with the resurgence of James scholarship that's often happened in some recent years, it's been mostly on the ethical and moral nature of James, as it is an exhortation to Christian life, which is true. That's what's going on in the Epistle of James. But it often comes at the cost of people saying things like there is no theology or little theology in the Epistle of James. Some people have said in regards to Christology that there is no Christology at all in the Epistle of James. And we both disagree with that statement. I've said this in a few other places, but if you look at James for theology, you're not approaching it like a theological treatise. You're going to have to look for its theology in a bit of a different way. And Peter has his own thoughts, of course, as well.
Yeah, that's right. If James has been known for anything kind of theologically or in New Testament studies, I guess it's the whole discussion about, does James, in talking about faith and works, contradict Paul in talking about faith and works? That whole discussion. The fact that James reads very kind of Old Testament wisdom literature, kind of influenced, and the fact that people have noticed that James uses expressions that are very close to the teaching of Jesus that we would see, for example, in Matthew's account of the
Sermon on the Mount.
Sermon on the Mount. Thank you, brain freeze. And indeed, perhaps in simpler forms than we get in the Matthew account. So maybe James is closer to the oral source of that material, as it were, than Matthew is drawing upon. It would be interesting to see how that all kind of feeds into the discussion about the nature of Q, for example. That would be an interesting kind of discussion. So those are the kind of three areas that it's really kind of been known for, if anything. And I think you're right in that I'm not claiming to have stumbled across something new. I quote various scholars who've made these points, but I don't think it's something that James is particularly kind of known for. And I think I put together a number of points, as I say, kind of this. I come at this from a background in philosophy, and thinking about, well, making a cumulative case, and what kind of lines of evidence depend on each other or are separate from each other. So how can we kind of arrange thinking about this? So looking at internal and external evidence about the authorship. Can the authorship help us with the dating? Is there an argument for the dating that's separate from the argument from the authorship? If both of those lines, independent lines, point us in the same direction, well, then that's a stronger case than if we just have one line of evidence. So we're making a cumulative case. Then looking at the cumulative case for a high Christology in the letter. And of course, as someone with a Christian with a background in philosophy and who's written a lot in kind of the kind of apologetics field, I'm then interested in how does that feed into something like a traditional so-called, lunatic liar Lord argument. Because one way of going into that argument is to try and produce a case of what did Jesus say about himself that indicates he had a high Christology type image of himself, right? An indirect route into that is to say, what did Jesus's earliest followers believe about his status? And of course, it's possible that they completely misunderstood Jesus, but it seems quite an unlikely misunderstanding for monotheistic Jews to come up with in their context, if Jesus didn't do anything that gave them grounds for thinking that. You would probably think they would only think that if Jesus did things that gave them fairly strong grounds for going there in their interpretation of the things that he said and the things that he did. And how that all plays into how could they come to this view of someone who got so shamefully crucified, right? No, that was the end of all other Christological movements in the first century. So how does this feed into various apologetic arguments, including but not limited to a sort of lunatic liar Lord argument from an indirect route? And of course, if you've got a kind of direct argument of material for Jesus having a high view of himself and an indirect argument of Jesus' earliest followers having a high view of him, then those independently combine to indicate an even higher probability that yes, Jesus probably had a high view of himself. And then the question is, well, how does that fit? How does that square with the rest of the historical data we have about his character? I certainly would not put forward a lunatic liar Lord argument as a simple kind of deductive argument that leads to kind of QED, therefore Jesus is Lord, right? The way I would frame it is saying this is an argument that gives some evidential weight to the conclusion that Jesus is Lord. Someone who is a non-Christian coming to this argument may think, yes, that is an argument that gives some weight to that Christian view of Jesus, but not enough to change my fundamental view about Jesus, right? But if they think that it does bear some weight, they should then think, I am now, although I am still skeptical about the Christian view of Jesus, I am now less skeptical than I would be if I did not know this argument. Okay? It moves me closer to the Christian view, although I don't have a Christian view. But what then happens if that person then grapples with the historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus, for example? They are coming at that argument slightly less skeptical of the Christian view of who Jesus was than they would otherwise have been. And that may affect their prior probabilities and things. And by the time you go through a kind of cumulative argument of independent arguments that all point to the same kind of conclusion, right? So you're not looking for, like, give me a knockdown certainty premise, certainly follows certainty conclusion kind of case. But you're asking for a kind of cumulative case argument that may gradually erode skepticism, may gradually shift someone closer to a Christian view. And as they keep track of their epistemic situation, they may find themselves moved over that kind of 50-50 line, as it were. And only that individual is going to be able to tell you whether that's the case, as they do their best to honestly grapple with the evidence. It's obviously going to take, much more evidence to convince someone of the divinity of Jesus if they come at the issue with a firm conviction that a naturalistic worldview is true. It's going to take more evidence to convince them than someone who comes at the issue as an agnostic, right? And it's going to take more evidence to convince them than someone who comes at the issue thinking, yeah, there's probably some kind of supernatural creator, but I'm not sure if that being, is interested in humans or would do miracles or has revealed himself in any way. But I suppose it's possible, etc. So your kind of prior position as you come into the discussion is going to kind of affect how much particular evidence and argument you're going to need to be shifted to a new position on the issue. You may find yourself, okay, I've shifted from being a firmly convinced naturalist to being a slightly less convinced naturalist, or I'm now an agnostic, or I'm now. But as I say, there are more than one kind of line of evidence into this issue, and a lunatic liar lord type argument grounded in the historical data that we have is only one of those pathways, right?
And as we move to a close here, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe to this, to my channel in this video. Go follow Peter's YouTube channel, which was linked down below. And he'll probably have this up on his channel too at some point. If you see it there, go watch it again and like it there too. That helps us both out a lot. We do everything here on Practical Christian Lessons completely for free, and that is the way we intend to keep things going. But if you want to join us in ministry or help us out in any way you can, that's one way you can do it, and you can go find us in other places. That will also be linked down below. As we move on here with our discussion with Peter, one thing I wanted to bring up and pick his brain a little bit on before we closed out as time was coming to an end was something he had said in his presentation, and he brings us up in the article. For monotheistic first century Jews and even second century Jews, it's not very likely that they're going to go around calling Jesus God unless they have very good warrant to do so in the proper full divine sense. And we see that happening with James, with Jude, as I've talked about on my channel, and others. And one of the things that sort of hints at this in the Epistle of Jude is his use of the word Lord. And of course, there's some historical and cultural context behind that term that Peter's going to talk about. When you look in the epistle as well, James doesn't seem too concerned with is Lord applied to the Father? Is Lord applied to Christ? There's not really this goal of disambiguating them. We don't get into that as much as some of the other stuff. If you want to delve into that, see my article coming out, Lord willing, this fall, or Anthony Rogers has a 2-part video series on Christology and the Epistle of James. Watch the first video, and he covers that in depth. With that, we'll let Peter wrap it up.
Yeah. So the Jews famously, wouldn't take the divine name upon their own lips, and they substituted the Greek my brain's going blank. Is it Kyrios for that? And although they had substituted a Greek word, actually they refused to call Caesar Lord, to call Caesar Kyrios, because they reserved that for this use of talking about God. And we're not going to call Caesar Lord, right? So yeah, they're particular about their language, and I mean James straight up talks about Jesus as Lord, and I think it seems less plausible to simply try and say, oh, he just means that as a term of respect, right? Given cultural context, yeah. And anyway, you could also punt to Paul accepted Pauline letters in the 50s. Paul seems to divide the Jewish Shema prayer up between God the Father and Jesus in the same breath. There's clearly the New Testament is not giving us a kind of worked out Council of Nicene Christology or something here, but the putting of Jesus into the orbit of the divine with a capital D, I think is very clear. The putting, I think we could put it this way: that the fundamental dividing line in reality for the Jewish mindset is the line between the creator and the created. God is the creator. Everything else that's apart from God is the created, right? And the New Testament clearly puts Jesus on the creator side of that line. Whatever else you do with your philosophical theology, you've got to take that into account in how they're treating Christ as on the created side of the line. Sure, creation happens through Christ, but Christ is the one, again, this is Pauline, upholding creation, in whom all things hold together. John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, or, I think I would advocate for translating it now, was divine. With a capital D, we're not talking about, he was like Zeus, right? So if Jesus is on that creator side of that fundamental distinction, then you have to go and work out your theology from there. So just from my website, if you navigate through to the papers section, you'll find a link through to the free copy of the original paper on High Christology in the Letter of James that was published in the open access journal Theophilus. The updated version of that is in my book Behold the Man, Essays on the Historical Jesus, which is my kind of most recent publication about the historical Jesus. Some years ago I did a big book replying to kind of new atheist views about the historical Jesus, a big book called Getting at Jesus, a response to neo-atheist nonsense about the Jesus of history. So those are my kind of two most recent books on the topic. And my website will guide you through to my podcast and my YouTube channel. And you can subscribe there to my newsletter, which I'm trying to do once a quarter. So I won't flood your inbox with stuff, but I'll keep you updated with what I'm doing, and give you links through to podcasts like this that I've appeared on, and any kind of things that I put out, things that I'm working on, keep you in the loop. So it would be great if anyone wants to sign up to my newsletter.